The airfields of Britain, once vital to the defense of a nation in turmoil, now stood abandoned in the post-war silence. The runways, once busy with the roar of military aircraft, were now cracked and overgrown. The hangars, which had once sheltered the tools of war, were empty and decaying. As the need for these airfields faded, so too did their place in the world. These massive military hubs, constructed with urgency and cost, were now symbols of a bygone era, slowly reclaimed by nature, discarded in the face of austerity and the pressing need for rebuilding. It was the end of 1945, and in the stillness of the British countryside, something unsettling began to take shape. Thousands of airfields, once the epicenters of fierce air battles, now stood empty, their runways cracked and overgrown, their hangars silent. A network of military infrastructure, purpose-built to support one of the greatest conflicts in history, was now left to decay. In the aftermath of World War II, Britain faced a monumental challenge: what to do with the vast expanse of war surplus infrastructure. With the war officially over, the necessity for a wide-reaching air defense system no longer felt urgent. The once crucial role these airfields had played now seemed to belong to another world, a world of conflict and need. But the world that followed was one of recovery, austerity, and the looming threat of economic collapse. The question remained: could Britain afford to keep these airfields in operation? The scale of the abandonment was staggering. Over 1,000 airfields had been constructed during the war, scattered across the UK. Many were built quickly, hastily, and with only the barest of considerations for their post-war existence. Some were nothing more than emergency landing strips, others, massive military hubs with state-of-the-art facilities. These structures had cost millions of pounds to develop, and yet, with peace now achieved, their utility rapidly diminished. The government, strapped for cash and eager to shift its focus to rebuilding the war-torn economy, faced an unenviable decision. The upkeep of these airfields, combined with the ongoing financial strain of demobilizing a vast military apparatus, was an expense Britain could not bear. At the time, the immediate impulse was to reduce this burden. Airfields were closed down, and in many cases, their buildings and runways were simply left to deteriorate. For the British public, the transition from war to peace was not a clean break. It was one of anxiety, uncertainty, and the cruel reality of economic deprivation. Factories that had churned out weapons and supplies now sat idle, while millions of soldiers and workers were demobilized. The widespread economic austerity only added to the sense of loss. The airfields, once symbols of national strength and defense, were now more like relics of a bygone era. One of the largest groups of airfields to be abandoned were those used primarily for training and reconnaissance. With the war over, there was no need to maintain such facilities at their full capacity. The logistics of keeping these locations active became increasingly unfeasible. However, some airfields had also been involved in more specialized operations, such as radar installations, research centers for aircraft development, and bases for the recently introduced jet fighters. These fields, though more modern, were equally at risk of obsolescence. As the airfields were decommissioned, many began to quietly fall into disrepair. Without the urgency of war, maintenance was no longer a priority. The first signs of neglect were subtle: cracked tarmac, overgrown grass, and the slow erosion of once vibrant hangars and control towers. Yet, for the military, these airfields were still seen as valuable assets. The question now was whether the nation could afford to repurpose them for future use or simply let them be forgotten. The economic pressures in Britain during the immediate post-war years were intense. The cost of war had drained the nation's resources. In 1945, the UK was facing crippling debt levels, largely from borrowing to fund its wartime efforts. As the government worked to stabilize the economy, priorities shifted. The focus moved from maintaining an expansive military infrastructure to recovering vital civilian industries. The airfields, built with a sense of urgency during the war, were now considered burdensome. The need for a strong air defense was lessened, and with it, the need for vast, well-equipped airfields seemed less critical. In 1946, the British government began its first efforts to divest itself of the airfields. Several were simply closed, their gates locked, their properties left to deteriorate. Some were offered for sale to private entities, but the sheer scale of the infrastructure made it difficult for anyone to take on such a project. The costs of maintaining or repurposing the fields were high, and few businesses had the means or desire to invest in what had become a symbol of wartime waste. The fate of the airfields varied widely. Many were left to the elements, forgotten and reclaimed by nature. Some of the smaller, less strategic airfields were sold to farmers or other private landowners who either neglected the sites or used them for agricultural purposes. The land, though valuable for its size and location, had become an inconvenient reminder of a past that many were eager to forget. On the other hand, a number of airfields did find new life. Some were converted into civil aviation hubs, repurposed to accommodate the growing post-war demand for air travel. The shift from military to civilian aviation was a natural one, but it did not solve the problem of the enormous expense required to maintain such sprawling sites. Only a small percentage of the airfields were lucky enough to be adapted for civilian use, and these were typically the larger, more strategically located fields. Others met a more practical fate. The buildings and infrastructure of many abandoned airfields were salvaged for materials. Steel, timber, and concrete were all valuable in post-war Britain, and the scrapping of war-era sites was seen as a means to reclaim some of the resources used in their construction. The process was slow, and in many cases, it was not enough to cover the financial burden left by the airfield's upkeep. The psychological and cultural impact of these abandoned airfields cannot be overstated. The vast emptiness of the sites, their once thriving runways now haunted by silence, seemed to mirror the desolation that many felt in the wake of war. These fields had been symbols of a struggle, of nations pitted against each other, and now they were simply reminders of the devastation left behind. In the minds of many, the idea of dismantling or repurposing these sites seemed almost sacrilegious. Yet, the practicalities of the time were clear. Britain could not afford to maintain this wartime infrastructure, and so, like many other relics of the war, the airfields were left to their fate. In some areas, airfields remained partially active for decades after the war, but the general trend was one of slow abandonment. The airfields, once the backdrop to some of Britain's most crucial military efforts, were now the forgotten remains of a nation's struggle. The buildings began to fall apart, their steel frames rusting, their hangars collapsing. In the harsh conditions of the British climate, nature took its toll. By the early 1950s, many of the airfields had been almost entirely reclaimed by the landscape. Grass and shrubs grew through cracks in the tarmac. Control towers, once high and vigilant, stood like skeletons, their windows long shattered. It was as if the world had turned its back on them, leaving them to rot. Yet, amidst this abandonment, some airfields were kept on standby, reserved for emergencies, though they were little more than shadows of their former selves. At the same time, there was a sense of urgency within the military to find ways to preserve some of the strategic locations. Certain airfields were earmarked for conversion into storage depots or as locations for reserve training. Yet, as each year passed, the true scale of the abandonment began to set in. The challenge was no longer whether to retain or dispose of these sites, but how to come to terms with the magnitude of the loss. The once vibrant airfields now stood as quiet symbols of the post-war transformation. They embodied the delicate balance between maintaining a national defense and navigating the immense economic pressures of peacetime recovery. The airfields were not just physical sites, they were echoes of a time that Britain had hoped to leave behind. Yet, in their silence, they carried a weight of history and a reminder of a world that could no longer be sustained. The fate of the deserted British airfields in the years following World War II unfolded in a way that reflected the struggles of a nation attempting to redefine itself after the devastation of war. By the early 1950s, many of the airfields that had once been the lifeblood of military operations had been reduced to little more than ghostly remnants of the past. The shifting priorities of the British government, weighed down by the economic pressures of peacetime recovery, combined with the national desire to distance itself from the horrors of war, meant that these sites would never again see the bustling activity they once had. Yet, not all of them were left to rot. For some, the transition was slow, painful, and ultimately, a reflection of the changing face of post-war Britain. In the early post-war years, the British government still viewed these airfields as potential resources, though the nature of their future use was unclear. The end of the war had left Britain financially crippled, and the government's priority was the reconstruction of civilian life, not the upkeep of wartime infrastructure. To some, the very idea of continuing to maintain and operate these military facilities felt like a misplaced loyalty to the past, a reminder of a time of struggle and hardship. In light of this, a considerable number of airfields were simply abandoned, left to deteriorate in the wind and rain. Yet, this abandonment was not uniform. Some airfields, particularly those that had been used for more specific functions like radar stations, remained under military control well into the 1950s, as they were deemed useful for national defense, albeit in a more limited capacity. Others, however, were seen as excess, an expensive luxury in a time of severe austerity. Some of these airfields were sold off, though few buyers were eager to take on the massive task of repurposing the land. The cost of renovation or even maintenance was too high, and the vastness of the land made it impractical for private use. For a while, these airfields were in limbo, slowly falling into ruin while the British government searched for ways to either sell or repurpose them. But as time passed, the war began to fade into memory, and with it, the urgency to find a solution for these military structures. In the years after the war, many of the airfields were left to decay in the face of harsh British weather. The concrete runways cracked and crumbled under the pressure of time and neglect. Hangars that once housed aircraft stood empty, their doors rusted shut. Control towers, once busy with the sounds of radio chatter and the coordination of military movements, now remained eerily silent. Nature began to reclaim what was once man-made, grass grew through the cracks in the tarmac, and vines crept up the sides of buildings. In some areas, the airfields became little more than forgotten memories in the landscape, unrecognizable from the once bustling centers of wartime activity they had been. At the same time, there were efforts to salvage what could be salvaged. In some cases, the materials that made up the airfields, steel, timber, and concrete, were stripped from their original sites and sold off for scrap. This process, known as salvaging, was not limited to airfields. It was a widespread practice in post-war Britain, as every piece of material was seen as potentially useful in the rebuilding effort. The steel from airfield hangars, the concrete from runways, and the wood from buildings were all recycled to be used in the construction of new civilian buildings or infrastructure. But even this salvaging was slow and insufficient to make a dent in the problem of what to do with the vast expanse of land and infrastructure that had once been devoted to the war effort. In some cases, the airfields were repurposed for other uses, though this was more the exception than the rule. Some airfields were converted into civilian airports, serving the rising demand for air travel in the 1950s. Yet, even these transformations were not without difficulty. The sheer size of the airfields made them difficult to adapt for civilian use. The runways, designed to accommodate military aircraft, were often too long and too wide for commercial planes, which meant that much of the infrastructure had to be modified. Even the larger airfields, which seemed ideal candidates for conversion into civilian airports, were not immune to the same economic pressures that had plagued their original existence. The costs associated with repurposing these sites, maintaining them, and updating them for civilian use were often more than the government was willing or able to bear. In some rare cases, airfields were transformed into centers for industry. The government, eager to take advantage of any useful infrastructure left behind by the war, looked to repurpose some of the airfields as industrial parks or storage facilities. These sites were seen as potential areas for the relocation of civilian factories, but the cost of converting these military structures into usable spaces was high. Many factories, eager to avoid the expenses of relocation, simply refused to move into these former military sites. And so, the airfields sat empty, waiting for new uses that never came. Even as some airfields found new life, the majority were left to rot. In the mid-1950s, the pace of abandonment quickened. The military's need for large, sprawling airfields was greatly diminished as jet technology advanced, making the need for the vast networks of airfields less pressing. The rise of nuclear weapons also contributed to this shift. Britain, like other nations, began to focus on missile defense and the construction of specialized facilities for nuclear weapons testing and research. Airfields, once essential to air defense and military mobility, had become obsolete in the face of new, more advanced technologies. The British government began to slowly sell off or demolish the remaining airfields, especially those that had once housed high-performance aircraft or those located in more remote areas. Some were even cleared entirely, their history erased in the process. The vast land that once had been home to military personnel, aircraft, and high-tech equipment was now repurposed for housing or other civilian developments. In some places, entire towns sprang up on the land that had once been an airbase. Others were left as open fields, quietly fading into the landscape, a quiet testament to a time long gone. The abandonment of these airfields represented not just a physical loss but a psychological one as well. These were not just buildings or strips of land, they had been symbols of national pride, of Britain's military might during the war. The people who had worked at these airfields, the engineers, pilots, soldiers, and support staff, had once seen them as the front lines of defense. To see them discarded, left to decay in the elements, was a sobering reminder of the transience of military power. The economic necessity of dismantling these airfields was a harsh reality for a nation that had once placed such importance on them.